Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to another episode of The Impossible State at CSIS. My name is Victor Cha. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at CSIS. And we're very happy to have with us today Jinmyung Kim, who is the correspondent for Chosun Ilbo. Chosun Ilbo is the largest daily newspaper in Korea. She has covered foreign policy and national security for more than a decade. She's reported from the White House, the State Department, South Korea's presidential office, and various locations around the world. She began her career at Chosun Ilbo in 2006, and she holds a Master's of Science in International Affairs from London School of Economics and Politics, and a Master's in International Relations from Peking University. And in addition to speaking Korean, she can speak English, Mandarin Chinese, and Japanese, which is really impressive. You should probably be the Senior Vice President for Asia at CSIS rather than me. I can barely speak Korean, let alone Mandarin Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. But I asked Jinmyung to join us today to talk about the big summit, the state visit that happened last week. Clearly a major event, Biden's second state visit given to a foreign leader. The first was, of course, to Macron of France. Very big event, very important event that we're going to talk about today. But first, let me just, for our listeners and viewers, just run through some of the major accomplishments of the summit. So as I said, this is a state visit. The White House very rarely gives state visits. It's the highest honor that the White House can afford to any foreign head of state. This was given to President Yoon, I mean, largely because it was the 70th anniversary of the alliance. It's the 70th anniversary of the Mutual Defense Treaty. It is the 70th anniversary of the armistice ceasing hostilities in the Korean War. So 2023 is a very momentous year for U.S.-Korea relations, and I'm sure that was part of the reason. But I think another reason was that they really wanted to pay respect, congratulate, support President Yoon on his foreign policy agenda, and in particular, alliance relations, as well as President Yoon's very ambitious global agenda. So a very special meeting. He was here for virtually the whole week, right? He was here for the whole week, several days in Washington and then to Boston. What distinguishes a state visit is the arrival ceremony on South Lawn in the morning, and then, of course, the state dinner in the evening. I attended both. The arrival ceremony it's beautifully done. It's a very special event, and the state dinner is like nothing else that you could ever imagine going to in terms of the best and the coolest dinner party ever. Truly, the best and the coolest dinner party ever. But of course, it wasn't just about the pageantry. There was real business to be done there. The main deliverable of the summit was something called the Washington Declaration, which we will talk about in a minute, that tries to address South Korea's concern about extended nuclear deterrence in terms of deterring North Korea from disrupting the peace. But in addition to extended deterrence and the Washington Declaration, the summit had a number of other deliverables, talking a great deal about Yoon's global agenda when it comes to things like hosting the next democracy summit, partnering with NATO as a member of the NATO AP4, Asia Pacific 4, which is South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. They're meeting this summer in Lithuania, and also with the G7 when they're meeting in Hiroshima. And of course, very bold statements by President Yoon on Ukraine, which I'd also like to talk about. And then finally, there were a number of major agreements on what I call what Mark Lippert, our friend Mark Lippert, calls the new frontier issues in the alliance. These are not just the economic and the security issues, but there are the other issues that take the alliance beyond sort of trade and security to things like quantum information science and technology, critical and emerging technologies, cybersecurity, AI, biotech, biomanufacturing, a whole host of agreements and discussions in that respect. But there's plenty here to talk about. But Jinmyung, let's start by talking a little bit about the Washington Declaration. So, this, as you know well, amounts to arrangements that are effectively de facto a sort of nuclear planning a process between the U.S. and South Korea, in which South Korea will have much better insight and participation in nuclear planning scenarios, training, discussions. It's not nuclear sharing like NATO, but in this nuclear consultation group, the NCG, they've really created a new piece of the alliance that we haven't really seen before, that I think makes it quite significant. But I'd like to get your views on the document itself and what you think about it, and also the domestic reaction.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. And so when I think about Washington Declaration, I think it's a realistic solution to address the concerns that both South Korea and the United States have respectively. And so if I put myself in the shoes of the government officials who engaged the negotiation of wordings of this declaration, I surely think, I believe they did their best to address all the concerns and because they have realistic constraints, and I can understand why they see this as a really historical and significant agreement. And when we look at the Washington Declaration, at the end of the declaration, the President Biden and President Yoon wants to send a firm message to the international community that any and all threats will be met with decisive response from the two allies. I think it is really the core of the message that we wanted to see, and it's really successful, because if we see the reactions from North Korea and China, their fierce opposition, I think it itself just shows that this is clearly signals the message that we wanted to send. But from the domestic point of view, it's a little more complicated, because so that's why I say this is a realistic solution. Probably a lot of South Koreans think this is not the ideal document they wanted to see, because first, because the South Korean society is so polarized, so it is really difficult to satisfy all the desires from all the different factions within the society. And so if we see the domestic reaction, you probably already know that from the left and right, they both have some complaints about the Washington Declaration. It's a totally different logic, but for example, I think we will discuss it later, but from the conservative side, they think.
Yeah, let me pull up. So let's just pull up. Okay. Let's pull up some examples of that. Mm-hmm. So we'll pull up a tweet from our good friend Michelle Lee at the Washington Post, where she showed us what some of the reactions were among the conservative papers with regard to the summit and the Washington Declaration. So if we let me see if we can zoom in on some of these for our viewers. Let me see if I can get this to. So here we have from Chosun Ilbo. It says, with regard to the Washington Declaration, furthermore, it repeatedly confirmed the asymmetric reality of the ROK U.S. alliance by specifying that Korea will provide conventional support for U.S. military operations. And then. Is that the only one we have? I guess that's the only one that we have there. But also, it's worth noting that your newspaper as well, Chosun Ilbo, also was a bit critical of the Washington Declaration. So I know you can't speak for the editorial page of the paper, but love to get your thoughts on the reaction from both the right and the left in Korea.
So the reaction from, I'll begin with the reaction from the right, because I work for a conservative newspaper, and I can. So the core question we have about nuclear deterrence against North Korea, I think the problem is we are not questioning the current state of military preparedness or readiness of the alliance. Many people who have some complaints about this Washington Declaration, I believe they don't question the current state of alliance. They probably believe that the resolution and commitment of Biden administration to defend South Korea. But why the conservative side was not satisfied is they think this Washington Declaration took the future potentials of nuclear armament of South Korea from them, and because President Yoon officially declared that South Korea will adhere to its obligations to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as well as the U.S. ROK agreement about free use of nuclear. So I think that is sort of taking away the future potentials and future options. Of course, realistically, it is really difficult to think South Korea withdraw from NPT right now and develop nuclear weapons, but conservative side wants to have this potential option on the table, and so that's why they are so disappointed with this agreement, because it is like officially exclude those options from the table. And from the reaction from the left, I think I've read the editorials from Hangyeore or Gyeongyang or other progressive newspapers, and their concerns are about so this Washington Declaration can further alienate North Korea from engaging any dialogue with South Korea or the United States, and they also think there might be some potentials for invite retaliation from China or Russia, because two presidents are sending this foreign message to international community, not only North Korea. So I think that's the basics of domestic reactions.
So on the one hand, the left thinks the declaration is too strong, and the right thinks the declaration is too weak.
Yes, you're really good at summing up.
Yeah. One of the things I learned in government is when that happens, that probably means you got it just about right. If you hear that from both sides, but yes, I mean the North Korean and the Chinese reactions really sort of that's really the proof is in that pudding, in the sense that their reaction to it really does kind of tell you a lot about how far this agreement has taken the alliance in this direction with regard to nuclear deterrence. Do you have like particular views on like how your newspaper responded? Did you expect your newspaper to respond that way, or did you not think that? What did you expect, or were you surprised, or were you not surprised? Or?
Frankly speaking, on that day, I was too busy to think about editorials because I have to like deal with many things. So I didn't expect to see the word shekel, but I can just imagine. I could imagine. Maybe this is not the perfect solution, perfect declaration they wanted to see, and a lot of people wanted to see. And to some extent, I think it's understandable, because we are talking about the extreme situation that North Korea may launch nuclear attack against South Korea. So no matter how much reassurance we have from the United States, it's really hard to imagine what actually will happen on that moment. And I want to point out that this declaration, I think this is really ambitious title, right? Washington Declaration. It's not something else, but it's still not a legally binding agreement. So we don't have any guarantee from the U.S. side that the United States the future U.S. presidents will do the same thing for the South Korea, and future U.S. government's actions. We can't really predict it. So I think that's the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about the declaration, I think you're right. It is very ambitious, calling it the Washington Declaration, a separate document from the joint statement on the 70th anniversary. And, it'll be a document that'll sit alongside the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty from now on, even though it isn't ratified by Congress. But, at the same time, this nuclear consultation group, this NCG group, will certainly last during this administration. And in addition, it wasn't in the joint statement or in the declaration, but in the fact sheet, there was also something about South Korean military officials and officers getting trained in the United States in sort of nuclear stuff, which I thought was also an important statement of trying to change the dynamics of the relationship when it comes to talking about nuclear weapons. Up until now, it's always been, the United States always says, don't worry, just trust us. We handle this part of the alliance. And now there seems to be much more willingness to talk about it, obviously behind closed doors, but to talk about it in a way that's operational. And the training part is important because if South Korean military officials and officers are going to be trained in this, then they will have a better sense of what questions to ask and what do the scenarios mean and all of that. So I think that in that sense, we hope that it's going to be the start of a process that will certainly bring the two allies closer together. On the point about reassurance, I think you're right. There's no question about capabilities, right? I mean, the U.S. and the ROK have the capabilities, but the reassurances that come with nuclear deterrence, now and historically have never been perfect, right? Even during the Cold War, they were never perfect in terms of our extended nuclear deterrence to NATO allies, to Asian allies. So I guess we have to just live with a little bit of uncertainty with regard to that, because allies will never feel 100% secure. Was it really a big issue in Korea that Yoon reaffirmed South Korea's compliance with the NPT regime? I mean, because I read in some places like people were very upset about that, or maybe it was on social media that people were really upset about that. And to me, it was that's just restating existing South Korean policy. Like they have no intention to withdraw from the NPT. So do you think it was because they would have preferred that you not do that to have the Washington Declaration without that clause in? Because that might leave an opportunity in the future for them to leave the NPT? I mean,
I think so. It feels like so. It's two different things, right? You have a policy and you talk about that policy. That I think those are two different things, and how this declaration affects the perception of South Korean public. I think the NPT clause is particularly affecting the base of Yoon government. So maybe that's the problem. So the complaint about NPT is not coming from the left, it's coming from the right, and the people who truly believe that South Korea should reserve the options for going nuclear in the future. Maybe not right now, but just to prepare for the unpredictability of the future. So I think that's the problem. So they feel like of course you're right, it is the existing policy of the South Korean government. Even President Yoon have never mentioned that he will withdraw from NPT. But when people look at this document, when they see the clause, they feel like it's something about future commitment. So actually, I'm not sure that this is a future commitment, and maybe future South Korean president can change that policy. But yeah, it feels like they don't get enough from this document, but they're giving too much.
So so it's actually not the criticism of what is being done as a result of the Washington Declaration, the NCG group, but it's really the NCG. But it's really this very last piece where he reaffirms South Korea's non-nuclear status that seems to have caught the most attention, certainly in the media and among the press. What about among the politicians? So I imagine that politicians on the left have criticized the agreement in the same way that Hangyeore, may have. But on the right, are there politicians also that are sort of in the same?
Yes, I've
vein?
read same response from the politicians because basically politicians, they also have this information through media first, right? They don't. Maybe they will have another briefings from the government from now on, but they just read the newspaper. They they watch the TV news. So that's how they get this information. And so I think the similar responses from politicians. And I think there's one thing that I want to point out as a journalist, because I think this Washington Declaration was not presented in its best way when it was first announced, because it is just technical issues. But the briefing first came from the White House, and so I think there was no coordination between South Korean presidential office and the White House how to present this document to the media. And so South Korean media first have this information from the White House briefing, and the White House naturally emphasizes this NPT clause because it shows that the concerns that the United States had have been resolved with this declaration. Right. So I think NSC officials sort of put emphasis on that. So that's how it is picked up by the South Korean media. And so in the hindsight, I think maybe there should have been some coordinated effort to convince media that this is a really significant and effective solution to the concerns we have.
That's interesting. I'd not heard that before, but that's actually quite interesting. So enough on the Washington Declaration. Let's talk a little bit on the economic side. Again, one of the things that struck me about this joint statement was, and particularly with regard to language in the sections on Japan, was reference not only to security coordination, but also to coordination on economic security. As you know, the Yoon government has proposed a 2+2+2, which would be the foreign minister and in the U.S., the Secretary of Commerce, the Minister of Trade and Industry, a 2+2+2 dialogue on economic security among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. There also is, of course, the issue of the Inflation Reduction Act and Korean concerns about that. And then, of course, export controls, the CHIPS and Science Act, but also the proposal for there to be control of semiconductor technology that would include Korea. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What was the press's view on those sorts of issues, or was all the focus really on the Washington Declaration?
I think for the first few days, the focus was on the Washington Declaration, but as time goes by, I read some articles and editorials from different newspapers about tech alliance and economic security clauses. So I think that's positive because, as you mentioned, this 2+2+2, and I also want to point out bilateral. I think its name is critical emerging, next generation critical and emerging technology dialogues. I think it is really significant if we just can make these things continue for a long time. Because when we think of other frameworks like IPEF, it's a multilateral platform. Of course, it is significant, but it is really hard to have tangible outcomes from multilateral platforms. But this 2+2+2 and this next generation dialogue, I think if we can continue to do this, maybe we can. The three countries will be able to pull something tangible from these dialogues, and And I think Biden administration and Yoon government have done a really good job to show that the U.S. ROK alliance is a relationship that shares the future, and that comes from these dialogues of economic security and technology. So I think that is the positive aspect.
Yeah, and it's this new agreement. This next generation critical and emerging technologies dialogue, which is the title. I don't think they have an acronym for that yet, but it's also very high level, right? It's led by the National Security Advisors, which is at a very high level. I was struck during the week that they were here by the references that U.S. officials were making with regard to Korea as sort of a technology giant, like a technology superpower. So really trying to portray to an American audience and a Korean audience and everybody else who was watching that Korea is an equal player in this, and that this bilateral relationship is quite unique because they're not just security allies and trade partners, but in terms of technology, they are both at the cutting edge, which is an important agreement. What did you think? Anything on the IRA that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, there's so two presidents mentioned about IRA, so they appreciate the recent efforts to mitigate the concerns of Korean companies, and but there's some domestic criticism that the two presidents fail to have a real tangible resolution to the concerns of Korean companies. And I have read an article about Hyundai Motors. So in the first 3 months of this year, the sales of electric vehicles worldwide has increased about 20%, but actually the sales volume of Hyundai electric vehicles decreased about 2%. And a lot of South Koreans point out that it is probably Hyundai Motors have taken a hit due to because they are excluded from this IRA tax credit. So, of course, it is disturbing for any South Korean to see that. And so, but I think at the same time, I understand why the two presidents can have more solution to this problem, because the IRA, it is a legislation, so it involves the U.S. Congress and the Biden administration. The White House or President Biden will have to think about the elections next year. So I can understand that. And overall, I just hope that we can overcome this disputes over IRA, because it is not. It is difficult to simply say that this IRA hurts South Korean economy, because if we think about the electric vehicle batteries, so some Korean companies benefit from it. So I just hope that in the long term, this won't be any significant issue anymore. So.
Yeah, and the exposure for Korean car companies with regard to the tax subsidy is temporary, right? It will. Once they start producing these vehicles in the U.S., then they will be able to take advantage of that tax subsidy. So, and then in addition, there is the waiver with regard to leased vehicles, right? So I think we'll be seeing a lot more Hyundais in the rental car market now, which would be a great thing, because normally when you rent a car, it's not a very good car, but it will be if it's a Hyundai car. And then. So I want to mention that one of the outcomes of the meeting, of the summit and the run-up to the summit, were announcements of U.S. new investments in South Korea. I mean, when these summits come, we always hear about these massive South Korean investments in Georgia and in Alabama and in Texas in cars and EV batteries and semiconductor foundry plants. But there's also been almost $6 billion of investment announced by Netflix and others going in the direction of South Korea. Did that register in South Korea at all, or?
I hope it will, because at first, so with the Netflix, they announced a $2.5 billion investment. That's huge, but Uh, but it's really interesting to see the domestic reaction. So actually, a lot of people have doubts about how this will impact South Korean economy because a lot of people think that Netflix already have earned a lot by distributing South Korean content, and they just don't know how this $2.5 billion will be spent. So there are a lot of questions about how the money will be spent and how fairly Netflix will treat the creators in South Korea, for example, original writers, original producers. So I think we have to wait and see how this will play out. I think the interesting part is like there were 6 U.S. high-tech companies who announced a total of $1.9 billion investment. Actually, I think they didn't get the full attention from South Korean media or public. But when I just look at the companies and what they do, and they will build production facilities in South Korea, but they are all related to really high tech. For example, hydrogen and carbon neutrality. So I think they represent the potential of the future that we share, the tech alliance and everything. So I just want to hear more from how these investments will go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there anything on, they mentioned sort of biotechnology and biomanufacturing, but was there anything on like, on that? I know that, in the past, Korea has been pushing very hard for licensing for producing vaccines and antivirals. But I didn't hear anything special about that. Maybe I missed it. Did you hear anything?
I think that's because it's really, so I believe the experts or the industry people from bio-industry, they probably know the importance of this investment and agreements. But for the general public, biodiversity, the concept itself is not, it's not something that you talk about every day.
Sure.
I think that's the reason.
Yeah. Okay. So in the time left, I wanted to cover just 2 more topics. One is, and we already talked about it a little bit, which is regional reactions to the summit. So the North Koreans have reacted very negatively to the summit, negatively to the Washington Declaration. I wanted to get your views on China, because I thought there were things that were said in this joint statement and in the summit, not so much in the summit, but in the joint statement about China by Korea that were really unprecedented. But I'd love to get your views on that. How do you think the Chinese will react or have reacted to this?
Yeah, I think that's something that we really have to look closely in the future because so on the surface, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned senior level diplomats from South Korean embassy in Beijing, and the main reason they expressed the dissatisfaction, I think the issues related to Taiwan. So they expressed dissatisfaction about the fact that the Yoon government is dealing the Taiwan issue as an international issue and regional issue, not as a China's domestic issue. That's the problem on the surface, but I think China probably have much more anxiety about what will happen between the U.S. and ROK and also including Japan, because we have so much more going on security on the security front and the tech front. And so I don't see the specific responses from Chinese government on this because probably they have some time. They need some time to digest what was agreed, and I think it's the same for South Koreans. We are waiting to see how these agreements will actually happen. For example, port calls of Ohio class SSBN, how that will happen, how frequently, and the nuclear consultative group, how the actual meetings will happen. So I think maybe China have more anxiety about that. And maybe, and So that's a sort of source of concerns within South Korea, how they will react to these agreements, how they will try to pull South Korea out of this alliance with the United States and Japan. So that's something we have to see.
Yeah. And then on Japan, President Biden gave a lot of credit to President Yoon. The term that I have noticed White House officials using when they talk about Yoon's efforts with Japan is they use the term political courage and leadership, which seems like it's a very deliberate statement. It's a deliberate talking point that the administration is using. Prime Minister Kishida is going to be. So I don't know when this podcast will come out later, but Prime Minister Kishida is going to Seoul this weekend,
right?
And so, what's the expectation? Do you expect that he will be bringing some gifts? The Japanese thus far have been fairly reticent in responding to all of this effort by President Yoon to take on a really difficult foreign policy issue domestically and really try to change it and move it in a different direction. And so, what are your expectations, hopes with regard to this upcoming summit in Seoul?
I think it is this Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Seoul is really important because I frankly I don't have any idea about how much Prime Minister Kishida will do to improve relations with South Korea. It's something that I cannot predict, but this is important because, as you have said, why the White House have commended President Yoon's political courage. That's because President Yoon have consumed a lot of political capital on this issue to improve ties with Japan and South Korean public. They think so far it lacks reciprocity. We Of course, a few days ago, Japan lifted export control of 3 key materials, semiconductor-related materials, to South Korea. That's a positive step. But what South Korean public probably want to hear from Kishida is something related to historical issues, historical disputes. And so I don't know how far he will go, but this is really important. So I just hope that he can signals that he also, not only President Yoon, but he is also willing to improve relations.
And they haven't. The other is they haven't. It was the exports of critical materials. Some statement with regard to, and it's not necessarily new. Just reiterating past statements that have been made, and then. And then the third issue is the fund, right? Whether Japanese companies will make contributions to the fund. I mean, they've spoken. The Business Federation has spoken positively of the forced labor agreement, which is a good sign. But I guess that's whether he's bringing that, as well. And if he doesn't, as you said, President Yoon has spent a lot of political capital. I want to go to our last topic, which is there's nobody who can talk better about the question of President Yoon and his domestic popularity than you can, certainly better than I can. And so I want to go to this graph that we put together that shows President Yoon's approval ratings over the course of April. And so for our viewers who can see this, we do see a slight uptick in, so we're still under 40 points here, but we do see a slight uptick by in the NBS poll and in what's the blue one, the Real Meter poll. Very small increases in the aftermath of the summit, or actually the week of the summit, April 28th.
Right.
So how do you interpret this, or in general, what are your thoughts on how he's doing at home?
So I think President Yoon's approval rating has been rebound for the first time in 4 weeks or 1 or 2 months. So I think it indicates the initial response from South Korean public about the state visit to the United States has been positive. But whether this will be a lasting political gain for President Yoon, I don't know. Maybe that's something that we have to see, because usually the approval rating after the major diplomatic event. So usually the approval rating of presidents has rebounded after these kind of diplomatic events. But it also has a tendency that doesn't last too long if without some substantial following up kind of events. So, for example, maybe it will be helpful that we see the protocol of SSBN or something related to the summit. So, and the one thing that I thought really interesting is if you look at the details of the polls, so there was one question in the Gallup Korea's poll. So the Gallup Korea actually asked people, was the state visit to the U.S. Helpful to Korea? 42% of respondents said it was helpful, but at the same time, another 42% said it was not helpful. And I think that just shows how polarized the South Korean society is, because the 42% who had positive views about the summit, they said they were satisfied with the strengthening of the alliance and the relationship. But another 42% said we gained nothing from this visit, and they were disappointed with the lack of substantial economic agreement. So that's really interesting, and I think that's the challenge that President will face, because our society is really polarized and people have really different opinions about how things should be done. And we have this another summit with Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, and I think you probably understand how controversial it can be. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this issue.
Yes, I can certainly understand that, and even if Prime Minister Kishida comes and he does, bring some things with him, there'll be some people who say, "Oh, this is great," and there'll be other people who say this is not so great. So I do take your point about polarization. Well, I think that we're about out of time. So I want to thank Jinmyung Kim, Washington correspondent for Chosun Ilbo, for joining us today. I think you're the first Korean journalist that we've had on the podcast.
Oh, it's my honor.
Yeah. So we hope we can invite you back. And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for listening to another episode of The Impossible State. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode. Thanks very much.